Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Samir Trabilsi, and I'm delighted to host this live debrief from the Global Initiative for Governance and Sustainability. Beyond the IMF World Bank meetings, governance, debt, and sustainability in a fragmented world. Today, we are not here to summarize the IMF World Bank spring meetings. We are here to step back and ask a more fundamental questions. What do these meetings tell us about how the global system is evolving and whether it is equipped to deal with the challenge ahead? Because what we are seeing today is not a set of isolated issues, it is a convergence of pressures, geopolitical tension, rising debt vulnerabilities, evolving financial risks, and increasing uncertainty around climate commitment. And at the core of all of this lies one critical dimension: governance. How decisions are made, how trade valves are managed, and how short term pressures are balanced with long term resilience. I'll be moderating today's discussion, and I will be also share a few reflections along the way, particularly from a governance, natural assets, and sustainability perspective. And as we go along, please feel free to share your thought and questions in the chat. We'll try to bring them into the discussion. I'll be joined today by an outstanding panel. Andrei Radiliscu, a leading expert in macroeconomics and financial analysis. Zilika Yarazor Knowles, with deep expertise in development and inclusion, and Monica Clark, a senior leader in finance transformation and operational strategy. And finally, Robert Bloom will be bringing a strong insight on governance and sustainability systems. Andre, let me start with you.
Yes.
Uh,
Good afternoon. Thank
yeah.
you very much, Professor, for the
Can
invitation.
you come
It's
here, please?
a pleasure to
Let me start with
continue
you.
this tradition
From
of
a
debriefing.
macro economic and financial perspective, what were the most important signals coming out of the spring meeting this year?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Professor Samir Trabelsi. It's a great pleasure for me to join you to the continuity of our tradition of debriefing at very important spring meetings and annual meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions. First of all, we have to say that this year the main debates of the institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions are focused on the crisis, on the conflict in the Middle East. It's another major global shock with, let's say, symmetric impact, but asymmetrical consequences. As Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, mentioned several times, it's a huge, let's say, it's a record number of people present here at the IMF and World Bank spring meetings, because everybody in the world, let's say, we are living in a high level, unprecedented high level of uncertainty that turns out to be permanent uncertainty. And actually, since the outbreak of the conflict in the Middle East, we had seen a significant increase in uncertainty level to the highest level since the spring of 2025, when you remember the fact that all over the world, everybody was focusing on the impact of the fundamental change in terms of trade policy in the United States. But also we had seen a significant increase in the price of oil. And in this context, the International Monetary Fund adjusted, let's say, the forecast for adjusted the forecast for growth and for inflation in 2026. First of all, IMF cut the forecast for the growth of the economic activity in the world by 0.2 percentage points to 3.1% this year. And on the other hand, IMF hiked or increased the forecast for global inflation, annual inflation in 2026 by 0.6 percentage points to 4.4%. So actually, we are, let's say, in a period of accumulating risks of a stagflationary, let's say, episode in the global economy. Happily, this morning, everybody knows that the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of the global oil and gas are used to transit every day, it opened, and this determined a significant decline in the price of oil. So hopefully, this conflict in the Middle East is going to be short-lived. And in this context, in the reference scenario of the International Monetary Fund, they consider the fact that the conflict in the Middle East will be finished by the end of this quarter.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. What are the fundamental changes compared to last year? Where do you think risks are being underestimated? Are we still in a phase of managing risk or moving into something more fragile?
From my point of view, we since the our previous debrief in October last year, many debates were focusing or have been focusing at the Bretton Woods institutions about the private debt risks, because we have seen over the past years a significant increase in the private debt all over the world. And of course, we see accumulation signals for the outbreak of a new economic and financial crisis, especially in the context of the fast implementation of the AI. And recently, I had a keynote speech in New York on the global economy in the AI Times. And nowadays, what is very important, from the fundamental point of view, we in the world economy, there are two variables that are not, let's say, published on a monthly basis, and these are the speed of money and the speed of information. So nowadays, the speed of information is multiplied, it's amplified by the implementation of AI. Imagine that in 2007, nobody had WhatsApp, nobody had Instagram, so the speed of information was pretty low. Nowadays, all the shocks are happening instantly, and the impact in terms of panics, it's instantly. So it's in 1 second, it's done. I notice a significant wave of optimism here during the spring meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions. So despite the fact that we have been surrounded by accumulating risks in terms of real economy, financial side of the economy, commodity markets, we can also talk about the possible crisis in agriculture due to the significant increase in price of fertilizers. But overall, people are optimistic, and this is very important to have to act in an optimist way in order to avoid, let's say, a global recession. And the meetings are ending with a happy announcement of the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. So hopefully the policymakers will understand and will implement the recommendations of the Bretton Woods institutions in order to increase the resilience in the world economy and to continue and to accelerate in a sustainable way the development in the less developed countries. Thank you.
Now, if I may build on that, what stand out is that we often interpret these signals of primary through a macroeconomic or financial lenses. But from a governance and sustainability perspective, this is a broader stress test of how country manage their underlying resources, their institution capacity, and ultimately their long-term resilience. Uh, and increasingly, that includes how natural assets are managed because they are deeply linked to economic stability. Now, let me now break it in key dimension. Uh, Zilika, uh, many countries, particularly in the global south, are facing tightening fiscal space and raising debt burden. What stood out to you in how these challenges were addressed during the meeting? And are current global mechanisms sufficient? Where are the biggest gaps? Financing, governance, or it's really a problem of coordinations? What are the risks if this gap persists.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for this. Would you like me to hold it?
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Okay, I'm so grateful for this question. Thank you. So, I think what stood out to me is that there's an increasing honesty in the room. And that was very clear to me, but not yet a sufficient shift in the system. So, what we heard from the Minister of Finance from Saudi Arabia was a very clear message. It was about the global state of affairs. And he said it's going to take a while for things to get better. And that matters because time is not neutral. Time looks very different depending on where you sit in the system. And I think that's important. For some economies, time allows for adjustment. And for others, what time does is that it exposes them to debt, to climate shocks, to social pressure, etc. And then I think importantly, the director of the IMF also reminded us that not all imbalances are equal, that their impact is highly asymmetrical. And that may be the most important point of all. So the fact that it's asymmetrical is also a point that was touched on by Nigel Clark, who's deputy manager of the IMF as well. And he emphasized the need to reprioritize spending and that we needed to target very clearly those who were most vulnerable, moving away from broader responses. And that's right. But the question is not just one of efficiency. There's also a question of fairness here. Because in many countries across the global south, what we're seeing is that governments are being asked to make narrow fiscal choices in contexts where the margins are already very, very thin. So when we talk about targeting the most vulnerable, we have to ask first who defines, right, vulnerability, but then also who absorbs the adjustments and who has the flexibility to invest even beyond survival. And I think that's important because what we're seeing is not just an imbalance, it's the uneven consequences of these things. Countries didn't enter this moment with the same buffers. They don't have the same access to capital or the same room to maneuver. And yet they're being asked to operate within a system that often assumes a level playing field. So from where I sit, the issue is not simply a debt management issue. It's whether the global financial architecture is capable of recognizing and then responding to an asymmetrical world in a meaningful way.
You know what? What I really find particularly important here is that debt is not only a financial constraint; it's also a constraint on sustainability. When countries are under fiscal pressures, the risk is that short-term economic decisions take precedence over long-term environmental and social considerations. And this is fundamentally a governance issue. How do we ensure that immediate financial pressure do not undermines long-term resilience? Uh, Monica, let me bring you here from a finance and transformation perspective. How do these global risks translate into decision inside organization? And the follow-up question is, are institutions equipped to respond effectively? And where do you see the biggest gap between strategy and execution?
Well, when we talk about global risks like economic uncertainty, inflation, supply chain issues, or even political instability, it's bigger than global. It passes down to our regular day to day businesses. It doesn't stay at the government level for long. And then at that point, businesses have to decide, like, do we have enough cash reserve? Should we slow down our spending? Should we delay our investments and things like that? So, from a transformation perspective, the risks actually push companies to evolve faster. And it's like fight or flight. If they want to stay in business, they know that they have to quickly adjust. So, that's very important. And so many companies are investing more money into technology.
Yeah. Let me bring Andre here. Andre, uh, are we entering a kind of new phase of financial instability? And where are the biggest systematic vulnerability? And are regulators keeping the pace?
Thank you very much again, Professor Samir, for the opportunity. Yes, indeed, we have seen a significant increase in volatility on the financial markets, and this is also noticed if you read the financial stability report issued by the International Monetary Fund during the spring meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions. And we can talk about, as I mentioned previously, about the accumulation of risk factors in the financial or the real sides of the economy. If we look at the financial side of the economy, if you read Bloomberg, for instance, or if you watch CNN, every day there are plenty of debates regarding the private debt market. So it's a significant, let's say, a significant increase in the risk perception in terms of private markets, especially here in the United States. On the other hand, if we talk about real side of the economy, we have seen a significant increase in the public debt GDP ratio. So, according to the latest estimate, the latest forecast of the International Monetary Fund, the public debt GDP ratio is going to increase to more than 100% by the end of this decade, so by 2029, and that will be the highest level since back in 1948. So, since immediately the end of the Second World War. Furthermore, we have to mentioned the fact that the most important risk in terms of public finance is that nowadays the largest economies in the world, United States and China, which contribute together by more than 40% to the global GDP, they have no real plans in terms of fiscal consolidation process. So according to the recent forecast of the International Monetary Fund, the public debt GDP ratio in the United States is going to outpace 140% by 2031, while in China the public debt GDP ratio is going to increase to 117% in 2031. So there are no real plans of fiscal consolidations in the largest economies in the world. And this is my last point in terms of public finance, is the significant increase in terms of the cost of financing. So the expenses with financing the public debt are going to reach 3% of global GDP this year. In this context, the conference is very important on sustainability and governance. There are many countries in the world that cannot afford to pay 3% of their GDP for very important things like education, research, health, and stuff like this. So many risks under accumulation, and I think from my point of view, especially taking into account this fast implementation of artificial intelligence, we are heading towards a new global financial crisis. Don't ask me when this is going to start, but we are, let's say, in a similar situation like in 2006, 2007 in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. And this brings up to an important governance dimension. It is not really about the underlying risks. There is a growing awareness of those. The real question is whether institutions, both public and private, have the capacity, incentives, and frameworks to respond effectively. And increasingly, that response needs to integrate not only financial performance, but also sustainability and long term value consideration. Robert, let me turn to governance and sustainability. And as you know, Robert, but climate was present, but also increasingly contested, right? How do you interpret the role of governance in shaping sustainability today? And are we seeing progress or fragmentation? Where is governance failing or falling short?
I'll give a Thomas Jefferson answer. The least governance is the best governance. He used to say the least government is the best government. So these long-term issues like climate and so on, they'll be put aside. When we have problems of supply shocks and so on, we're dealing with the here and now. Now, Kristalina mentioned early on in a conference is very important. So also the fiscal monitor and so on, that the experience we've had until now, the war and so on, the impact has been as equal to the impact of the two oil shocks of the 70s. So that's already happened. But that had a very good impact. Keep in mind, ever since then, world energy efficiency has steadily increased. And what I mean by energy efficiency, the use of the amount of energy used per unit of GDP, it's steadily increased, because the rule in economics should be that the best solution to high prices is high prices. In other words, don't try to subsidize. Don't try to subsidize this kind of thing. Now, right now we have we're in the here and now. We got a struggle, and the struggle is we got two shocks. We have a supply shock, but hey, earlier than this, we have a demand shock. What's a demand shock? It's the data center shock. It's AI and so on. For the United States to meet the demand for data centers, it is going to have to double the capacity of its existing electric power system in 5 years. That means it's going to have to do in 5 years what it's done in the last 150 years. And that's a tall order. China's going to endeavor to do the same thing. Now, the U.S. has a very efficient governance system for managing the power system and reliability. The U.S. has the most reliable power system in the world, least blackouts. But there are a lot of procedures. There's a lot of investment required to interconnect all this stuff, and that's going to take time, and it may slow down. It will increase the cost of data centers because in the meantime, they're going to have to produce their own power and so on, and not have other ratepayers pay for it, as the president has invoked. China is going to do it as fast as possible. And I think in China's case, you're going to see a decline in reliability on the grid, but the consumer is not important in China because it's not an electoral democracy. So the consumer takes a back seat. So if they have to take a hit, but also there's a national security problem. You don't want to have serious regional blackouts for a long time in China because that also has social repercussions. Now, in terms of economic impact, the poor in the world are affected. How you finance this? Think of it this way: the oil producers, like the Gulf countries, assuming at least that they'll be able to, you solve this Hormuz problem, that the oil producers are making money hand over fist because of these high prices. Well, they should be the ones providing the assistance for the net oil importers. And how would they do that? It doesn't need to be sort of handouts from the IMF, or the World Bank or whatever. That's a channel. But the issue is the investment that would come from the countries that are benefiting as energy producers should go into economic growth, which is a solution, especially in those countries that are the energy importers. So that makes a lot of sense. And growth is important. And one thing I have to object to, Kristalina said that monetary policy got to be very careful about interest rate management, not to over anticipate one way or the other, hurt growth or cause inflation. But they also said from fiscal policy side, they talk about targeted to those in need, yes, but one error to avoid is the colossal typical error of financing of subsidizing energy consumption. So the best solution for the poor, and this is my conclusion, in a high energy environment, is you don't subsidize the electricity consumption of poor people, because guess what? They're not going to reduce their consumption, violating this rule. The best solution to high prices is high prices because people reduce their consumption. If you give them subsidies targeted to we'll just subsidize your electricity, guess what? They're not going to reduce their electricity consumption. And that was the lesson of the first oil shock when the U.S. did that, and they learned the lesson. The second they stopped. The best way to do it is give money to the poor and let them spend it the way they want. And guess what? They're not going to spend it on electricity. They're going to spend it on other stuff. Now, the IMF doesn't like that because they think that'll trigger inflation throughout the economy because the prices of all the other things are going to increase because you're giving money. Well, that is a kind of conundrum that has to be solved. But the stupidest solution is to target it to energy consumption and subsidize energy consumption, and you'll never get out of the problem. So give give the poor, give people, just give them money. And that's not necessarily bad. That's not necessarily inflationary, because what you're targeting actually is the energy component of these products and so on, and the end user consumption. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. What this highlight, Robert, is that governance is no longer a supporting element. It is central to how we manage systematic risk. And from a governance and natural asset perspective, one of the key gaps today is that economic systems still tend to treat nature as external, while in reality, they are fundamental to long term stability and resilience. And until that is more fully reflected in policy and financial framework, this tension will persist. Monica, do you see uh, sustainability being effectively integrated into financial and operation decision making?
Yes, I think companies are taking sustainability a little more seriously nowadays. However, are not. But the companies that are doing it right, they're asking themselves questions like, will this decision save us money long term? Is it better for the environment and our brand? Does it make our operations more efficient? So, for example, when you're cutting energy use, it reduces waste, of course, but it's also better for the environment. So it's a win-win for everyone. And it can also lower costs for the business, and it's better for the environment. So that's where governments and the citizens work together and create change in that way in terms of sustainability.
Yeah. Let me uh, let's open this up, because these are issues that are really deeply unconnected. So, are institutions like the IMF and World Bank adapting fast enough in this world of shocks, uncertainty, and on top of this, unpredictability? Or they're structurally too slow? Are we moving towards a more fragmented global system? Is sustainability still a real priority, or kind of becoming secondary to geopolitical and economic pressures? And let me add a perspective here. One of the key risks we are facing is the growing disconnect between economic decision making and environmental realities. We are still operating, in many cases, as if natural assets are external to the system, when in fact they are really under pin long-term economic resilience. So the main question for all of you: are global institutions and the broader governance systems moving fast enough to integrate these dimensions into decision making? So, Zilika, how does this affect developing countries?
Thank you. I think it's an important question. I think, when we think about developing countries, one of the things that we have to take into consideration is that they can't make decisions only by themselves. This regional cooperation is very important. And at this spring session, I heard a lot of talk about globalization and what that's meant. But the truth of the matter is, the only way we're going to be able to really come up with policies that are thinking a little bit more long term is if we lean on our regional alliances, our regional, the African Union, for example, the Caribbean CARICOM, and lean on other countries and neighboring countries to get through. So I think that's really where we're going to see a little bit more resilience, a little bit of sustainability is going to be if we can think forward, but think forward together.
Uh, I'll turn it to Andre. How do market interpret this, Andre?
Um, Thank you for the moment. The markets have been quite resilient, taking into account the fact that the conflict in the Middle East was probably the most important, the most severe shock in the history of the energy market. So we had a significant, let's say, increase in oil price, and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which is very important for the global trade with oil and gas. Actually, 20% of the global trade with oil and gas it's passing through the Hormuz Strait. As regards your question regarding on the capacity of international financial institutions, I'm quite optimistic because we are here nowadays live from the let's say the monastery of international macroeconomics. So the reports are very good. They have been it's a strong research base here, and it's very important for the policymakers in the member countries of these institutions to take into account the high cutting edge research that is generated here at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So there are many risks under accumulation, but I'm quite optimistic that we are going to see, let's say, measures that would be implemented by the policymakers in order to avoid the global depression.
So, Monica, my question is, can organizations realistically adapt?
Organizations definitely can adapt, but a lot of organizations are running into a problem now where they don't have the infrastructure to adapt. So their computer systems are outdated, and there's so many new softwares that are coming out. But if your computer can't upload a new software because it's too old, then you'd have to change the whole infrastructure for your whole organization. And organizations are having a lot of difficulty keeping up with the trends and everything that's going on in terms of technology and things of that nature. So it's really an infrastructure issue that everyone is trying to work on to make sure that they keep up with the times and everything that's happening in the world.
And Robert, is governance keeping up?
Is governance keeping up?
Yeah.
In the following sense, there's a fragmentation going on. So as I think my colleagues here have suggested, there's kind of a regionalization. So a lot of these problems are going to be, solved at a more local level through, similarities of the countries and regions and so on. But I think more importantly, we got to look at the world too. We got to look at realistically at the prospect. It's terrible to think about, but the prospect of war. And, at some point, and even in the IMF, somebody should start modeling what the economy is going to look like in a war. If we have a bifurcated world, for example, what are likely to be the two parts? What's likely to happen? How bad is this going to be? You probably want to make sure people see how bad is this going to be in order to sort of avoid that. Now, one thing I want to say is there's also, you have, of course, international institutions, but you have external pressures on companies because of this movement toward war. Keep in mind, by the way, latest news is that the auto companies in the United States are now being asked to manufacture defense equipment. So we're moving that way. But one thing the Trump administration is doing, I think this is wise, the prospect of war or invasion, whatever, puts pressure on one of the party or one or both of the parties to change internally. So that was the Venezuela project. No, we don't have to go under. We just do these things, but we sort of make things such as the internal dynamics of the government move in the proper direction. Like Delcy Rodriguez are getting, and the other more ideological factions are pushed aside. He's hoping this is going to happen in Iran. They're increasingly fragmenting. There's a power struggle. So instead of battlefield, he's looking at the internal structures. The same thing will happen in China. If China's one of the points, there could be such pressure on the political system in China that there's no more Communist Party. That would be a huge, sea change in the rest of the world. So we just don't know, are we going to have a war? But even the greater prospect could cause changes in the internally in the major parties in these things too, that would ultimately avert the tension and so on, such as the ideology driven things. Thanks a lot.
Let me close with a rapid round. In 1 minute each, what is the one thing leaders should do differently after these meetings? And we'll start with Andre.
What the leaders should do after these meetings, or
Yes, in 1 minute.
in the world?
Yeah.
First of all, we need more multilateralism more than ever. So we need to settle down and to try to implement, let's say, peaceful negotiations, to promote, let's say, the balanced implementation of the technological progress. Otherwise, we are going to see a fast implementation of the AI that will generate more asymmetries in the current very fragmented world. So it's now the high time, is now the moment for the global leaders to gather and to try to revive the multilateralism. Here, live from the IMF headquarters in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for having me.
Zilika?
Yes, I'll keep it very brief. I think leaders need to move away from acknowledging asymmetry to actually designing for it. I think that's the key. So they need to put country-led and regional-led development at the center. We need to align financial systems and real-world complexity. And then we need to build partnerships. We need to be grounded in shared risk. And that also means that we need to be grounded in shared rewards.
Monica?
I would say leaders need to really work on gaining trust in their organizations, gaining trust in the citizens of their communities, because as we all know, funding has decreased and a lot of citizens are feeling as if there's corruption happening. So it's very important to create trust in the community and let your community know everything that's happening in the background, and just create trust so that everyone will feel safe.
And Robert?
You know, the MD, who's the MD? It's not a medical doctor. It could be a medical doctor. It's the managing director. It's Kristalina. So she's being a doctor too. She said that we got to prepare for shocks. You know, they're going to come. They're going to come in the future, and shocks get as serious, my contention, to even a war. So you have to face things. You have to build things to deal with these. You have to model these things. You have to be upfront with people and show them what the consequences are and so on, in order to make the right decisions. You know, the best decisions, ultimately, not to kill each other, and that would be the way to go. So this sort of preparing for shocks and for change, and you know, a certain fragmentation in effect, but being able to deal with it and together, countries either factionally or all together to figure all this out. Thanks.
In fact, from my perspective, I think the priority is quite clear. We need governance frameworks that more effectively integrate economics, financial, and natural asset consideration into decision making. Because without this integration, we risk addressing short term challenges while gradually weakening long term sustainability and resilience. Let me conclude with one reflection. What we are witnessing is not simply a set of economic or financial challenges, it is a broader systematic or systemic challenge that connect governance, sustainability, and the management of natural assets. And the real issue is not whether we recognize the risks, but whether we manage or whether governance systems are able to integrate economic and environmental priorities in a coherent and effective way. Because without that integration, we are not resolving pressures, we are displacing them over time. At GIGS, at the Global Initiative for Governance and Sustainability, we believe that natural assets are not peripheral. They are central to long term resilience and sustainability development. I really want to thank you, our speaker, and everyone who joined us today. Please join us on April 21st, 2026, live on LinkedIn for a session with Mr. Bailey Church from KPMG Canada, Daniel from University of Waterloo. We will be talking about nature outcome agreement area, linking conservation, financial reporting, and financing. This session will dive into how we can better connect nature conservation, financial reporting, and innovative financing mechanisms, a critical step toward embedding natural capital in mainstream economic decision making. We look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you in our future session. Hello, and you have a nice day. And see you in the next debrief of the IMF World Bank Annual Meeting 2026 in Thailand. Thank you and stay tuned.